You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 27th of January 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program.
El gobierno de Colombia informa que hemos superado el impasse con el gobierno de los Estados Unidos.
Colombia's President Petro backs down in the first tariff war of Donald Trump's administration. We'll have the details and ask whether Latin America's leaders can find ways to actually cooperate on immigration.
As a superpower, other countries in the world, specifically countries in this hemisphere, need the United States more than the United States needs them. I think that's a long-standing perception.
After that, we'll get the latest on Lebanon's extended ceasefire. We'll have a roundup of Nordic news and a fashion roundup with Monocle's Natalie Theodosi. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. US President Donald Trump can chalk up a first victory to his threat of tariffs as a means of having countries and their leaders do his bidding. This is after Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, refused to let military planes carrying deported migrants land in Colombia. The lightning-quick imposition of a tariff on Colombian goods by Washington prompted him to change his mind. Not before President Petro released quite the emotional statement proclaiming Colombia's independence. Andrew Thompson is a journalist and political risk analyst specializing in Latin America and joins me now. Andrew, great to have you back on the show. Can you first of all just walk us through this weekend's events?
Yes, I think the thing to bear in mind is that deportations have been going on for a number of years. What's happened is obviously the Trump presidency has put much, much greater priority on them, and a number of Latin American countries are beginning to react. In particular, there's what you might call a troika of Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil, who are basically saying, yes, it's in the US's rights to send undocumented aliens back to us, but it has to be done respecting their dignity. And in Petro's case in Colombia, he seems to have objected to the use of military planes rather than civilian planes to send people back to Colombia. In Brazil, a flight from the States was stopped halfway because the Brazilian authorities said they objected to the use of handcuffs on about 80 passengers on that flight. So, if you like, that's the kind of the way the battle lines look at the moment. And Petro has got off to an early and unsuccessful start, it has to be said, because he turned back 2 US flights, saying he wouldn't accept military flights. And then Trump responded and said, we're going to apply tariffs of 25% this week, rising to 50% next week, and a whole series of other measures, which are in effect kind of sanctions against Colombia. Petro at one stage said, well, I'm going to apply a 25% tariff on US goods, but he basically lost face and had to back down because, as I think it was mentioned in the introduction to this piece, in some ways, Colombia needs the United States more than the United States needs Colombia at this present moment.
Well, and also before President Petro backed down, he did release this long statement about relations with the United States. It was quite personal against Donald Trump, but also kind of Colombia's role, the role of indigenous people, and sort of he said basically that, we were here before you in the United States. Tell us a bit about that statement, because that in itself, even if he had to back down, was quite striking.
Yes, I think it tunes into what a number of Latin American voters, not all of them, feel. They do feel that the US has been the superpower, the colonial power, and they see Donald Trump as being a re-intensification of a colonial attitude that they felt other US governments, mainly the Democrats, had got beyond. So there is... It's quite an emotional subject. And Petro, we have to remember, was a one-time member of the left-wing guerrilla movement called the M19, whose whole ideology was a form of left-wing nationalism. Petro sort of is still pushing that line, although, of course, he faces quite a lot of internal opposition. And the former president, Ivan Duque, who's leading part of that opposition, of course, has criticized him severely for overplaying his hand, and from the right-wing opposition's view, needlessly angering an important market, export market and strategic ally.
Which does beg the question, Andrew, of where we go from here. What do you expect will be President Petro's next move? I mean, is there something else that he can do in order to sort of work with the administration, still get his point across? Or is this just a simple, a very simple case of having to do a complete 180?
I don't think, interestingly, of course, and as you'd expect, the Colombian official communique says, the conflict, the crisis is over. We are going to have talks in Washington next week to finalize the small print, whereas the Trump administration is, we've won on all counts. It's the sort of, the Trumpian style of doing politics. I think what Petro will look towards is a summit with other Latin American presidents, maybe in the next 2 weeks or so, to try and coordinate a response to what Trump is trying to do, not just on the question of deportations, but across other issues to do with migration, importantly issues to do with trade and those still threatened 25% tariffs, which Trump is saying he will apply against Mexico and Canada, and by implication other countries as well. So there will be a kind of a diplomatic response. If you're a bit cynical, there'll be lots of speeches. But what Latin American countries can do to confront Trump is at the moment fairly limited.
Thanks very much, Andrew. That was Andrew Thompson, journalist and political risk analyst specializing in Latin America. And for more on this topic, because as Andrew alluded to there, Colombia is hardly the only nation grappling with Donald Trump's deportation orders and the closing of the southern U.S. border. So for more on the Latin American response, I sat down with Jason Marchak. He's senior director of the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arsht Latin America Center. This was while in Washington for the inauguration last week.
President Trump, his first term as well as throughout the campaign, has been very focused on migration, specifically not only reducing numbers coming to our border, but stopping those who are coming to the U.S. border. And he's talked about very vocally during the campaign a policy of deportation of migrants. Where we need to see is exactly how did those policies look like in implementation, and also what might be challenged by some of those executive orders, because as we saw in the previous Trump presidency and even during the Biden presidency as well, migration-related executive orders have a tendency to be challenged in the courts. So you could assume that select orders will be challenged, and the question is through which districts are those executive orders challenged.
They can be challenged in the courts. They can also be challenged perhaps by other governments that have to work with the Trump administration in order to put some of this into effect. What is your impression of so far how particularly Mexico and Claudia Sheinbaum have been responding to what's coming? Yeah.
Well, I think, Claudia Sheinbaum and President Trump had 2 phone calls during the transition period. My understanding is one was in Spanish, the second one was in English, which was an attempt by the Mexican president to relate further to President Trump. She also has an interest in stopping the northward flow of migrants that are coming through Mexican territory as well. Migrant trafficking has increasingly become a business. It's no longer just a person deciding to leave their home and make the trek with their family or friends to the United States. There are transnational criminal organizations that are running the migration routes. And so for President Sheinbaum as well, there is a desire to be able to figure out how to further clamp down on migration. Now, the Remain in Mexico program, and In the previous administration, I mean, that required significant back and forth discussions with the Mexican authorities to be able to accept that the migrants can actually stay in Mexico while they're awaiting their time for an interview in the United States. So it's unclear at this point how that reinstatement of that program will actually pan out, given that it's unclear how much discussion there's actually been with the Mexican authorities thus far. The president has also spoken about massive deportations. I think it's important to point out the fact that former President Biden and actually President Trump during his first term, the level of migration deportation between President Trump term 1 and President Biden, Trump deported more, but it wasn't incredibly significant, right? I think that one of the big differences is that a Trump 2 term will be much more about the publicity as well of the migrant deportations, which is also meant to, cause fear in the unauthorized population here in the United States.
One of the interesting comments during this pretty extraordinary kind of press conference that Donald Trump had while he was signing executive orders, he had this line that essentially Latin America and their leaders need us more than we need them.
Right.
How do governments respond to something like that? How would you advise governments in Latin America to respond to something like that? How do you work with a leader who's kind of, to some degree, U.S.'s largest economy? That's always been true to some extent, but it's never been said in such a direct way. It's never been from a leader who's maybe quite as transactional, even though we already know what Trump was like in the first term. How does a government adapt to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, as you're saying, historically, Latin America has not been a priority for the U.S. administration. And historically, the perception is, as a superpower, other countries in the world, specifically countries in this hemisphere, need the United States more than the United States needs them. So I think that's a long-standing perception. And whether it's been kind of directly or indirectly articulated in that specific way, that is the impression that most leaders have across the hemisphere. I'm, frequently engaging with public officials at the highest level across the region, and there is a broad sense that the region is less important to the United States because the United States as a superpower is focusing on areas of the world where there are major crises, and there are a number of destabilizing factors and a number of concerns across the region, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua among them, but don't rise to the degree of a crisis. My advice to leaders around the region is to find those areas of synergy with the Trump team. And I think there will be some areas of synergy. I think that President Trump's concern about the proliferation of criminal gangs in the United States, his designation of criminal gangs as foreign terrorist organizations. Now, maybe the exact tactic is not something that every leader in the region is on board with, but most leaders across the region, their citizens' number one concern is security and the proliferation of criminal groups across. And so I think that there will be areas to work together. It's a matter of finding those points of synergy and seeing how we can best deploy the tools of the United States government to be able to do so.
That was Jason Marchak of the Atlantic Council's Latin America Center in Washington. And now here's Anita Riota with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Hundreds of thousands of displaced Palestinians are returning to their homes in northern Gaza. The return was delayed by 2 days following a dispute between Hamas and Israel over the release of an Israeli captive. Hamas has marked the day as a victory for our people. A rebel militia backed by Rwanda has announced the capture of the city of Goma in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. It is a major advance for the group and one of the most significant escalations in the conflict between the two countries in years. Bird feathers have been found in both engines of the Jeju airplane that crashed in December, this according to a preliminary investigation. The black box was found to have stopped recording when the plane was approximately 2 kilometers from the runway. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Anita. To Lebanon now, where a ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel has been extended past Sunday's deadline. This despite the fact that Israel has not pulled troops out of southern Lebanon as was planned. The White House, eager to keep things peaceful, has said it will continue monitoring a ceasefire until the 18th of February. Well, Leila Milana Allen is Monocle's Middle East correspondent and joins me now. Leila, great to have you back on the programme. Is this, on balance, good news?
Well, no, it's not really good news. Essentially, what's happened is that the US has been strong-armed into saying that this ceasefire has been extended as though that were a good thing. This part of the ceasefire, and the Lebanese government has been strong-armed into accepting that. This ceasefire was supposed to be, this initial period was supposed to be 60 days from the end of November. That expired on Sunday morning. Now, during that time, there have already been repeated hundreds of violations of that ceasefire by the IDF in South Lebanon. 90 people were killed just in the first month of that ceasefire, 90 Lebanese. On Sunday, 22 people were killed and more than 100 injured as people tried to go back to their homes in the south of Lebanon, which the IDF had said they were not allowed to do until the ceasefire expired. So they were going at the right time. Now, Israel says this is because the agreement hasn't really been properly enforced yet. The agreement is supposed to be that they will fully implement Resolution 1701, the UN resolution that brought to an end the last war between the two countries in 2006. What's supposed to happen is Hezbollah is supposed to pull 20 miles back behind the Litani River. The Lebanese armed forces are supposed to take over the south of Lebanon completely, and the IDF are supposed to pull back. The IDF says that transition hasn't happened efficiently enough. But in the end, there aren't really any signs that it's going to happen more efficiently in the next 30 days. And the problem is that Israel has also made some pretty clear signs that it wants to hang on to parts of territory in the southeast of Lebanon as a sort of buffer zone, which is not part of the ceasefire agreement and which the Lebanese government haven't agreed to.
Leila, as you suggested there, the Lebanese government has perhaps been strong-armed into this, as has Hezbollah. But what do you expect might be Hezbollah's response in particular? Do they have no choice to accept this, or could we potentially see a complete end to the ceasefire if this continues?
Hezbollah doesn't really have much choice. There's not much in it for them right now to respond. One Hezbollah MP essentially sort of railed against, this behavior from the IDF troops and continued to encourage patriotic southern Lebanese, as he called them, to keep trying to return to their homes. Of course, that causes great risk to them if they're being shot at by the IDF. Hezbollah is so badly decimated right now. It's not just the war, which obviously the war in Lebanon, which took out a lot of their major infrastructure and killed quite a lot of Hezbollah fighters. But more than that, really, is the fall of Syria. The fact that the Assads are no longer in charge of Syria, the fact that those supply lines from Iran to Hezbollah have been lost, which is obviously wonderful news for the Syrian people, but very, very bad news for Hezbollah. And they also don't have the payments coming in anymore from the Iranians and the Syrian government that they had when they were being used as foot soldiers on the ground in Syria. So that's a major problem for them, trying to figure out how to rearm now as they try to rebuild the areas that were so badly damaged during the war, which are still having significant problems. So there may be some small skirmishes. The likelihood of them trying to launch any large retaliation to this is small. They're also in a bad position politically because for 2.5 years, Lebanon didn't have a government. It had a caretaker government because they couldn't agree between all the different sects in government on a president and a prime minister. That finally happened a couple of weeks ago. We've got a new president in Lebanon who is Joseph Aoun, who is the head of the Lebanese armed forces. So he's, of course, heavily in favor of pushing forward this deal where the Lebanese armed forces will be the greatest power in the south of Lebanon. And Hezbollah agreed to that. They said it was a compromise. They were finally willing to do that because they were on the back foot politically. But then the prime minister, Nawaf Salam, was not the choice they wanted. He is a man who's very highly regarded, worked for the UN and the International Court of Justice for many years, and very internationally minded, very peace-minded. So, as I say, on the back foot militarily and politically, other than perhaps some small retaliations, it's really not in their favor to try and launch anything right now and disturb this ceasefire. They need time to rebuild financially and militarily.
And Leila, what do you make of the US role here under the incoming Trump administration? Because as you also suggested, this was sort of led by the US trying to force the Lebanese, the government and Hezbollah to agree to this. But they have only agreed until the 18th of February. What does the US want to happen between now and then?
Well, essentially, the US wants this to happen peacefully. I mean, what's very clear about President Trump, when we saw this with the Gaza ceasefire deal, which was exactly the deal that Biden proposed in May, but May last year, he was never willing to put his foot down and force Netanyahu to accept it. Trump's aide turns up to the negotiations, Stephen Witkoff, and says, listen, he's not going to give you anything else. He doesn't want a war to be still going when he comes into power. Stop this now. This is likely to be the same kind of behavior. Now, we're seeing this extension, and that is sort of an attempt to put a Band-Aid over this whole issue and pretend that the ceasefire is not cracking. But I expect there's now going to be quite a lot of pressure being applied to the Israeli side to say, look, we're not willing to have another war pop up. Lebanon is very important to the United States. They've been working very, very hard to keep it as a partner. They're very pleased now that this sort of Western-leaning new government is in power, and people are very keen to rebuild the country and rebuild the economy in the country. So I imagine there's quite a lot of pressure being applied there. But of course, really the main negotiator of the ceasefire wasn't just the US, but it was France, which is such a strong ally of Lebanon. And the French government has come out very firmly saying Israel is absolutely violating the ceasefire and they must abide by the terms, which Lebanon is doing. So between the two of them, we can only hope that, the pressure will now be applied for Israel to properly abide by these terms and actually pull out. Because, of course, what so many people fear is another occupation of the south of Lebanon, which happened after the civil war when Israel occupied the south of Lebanon until 2000 for many years.
Leila Milana Allen, Monocle's Middle East correspondent, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing. I'm Chris Chermak, and it is time now for a roundup of Nordic news with Petri Bertsoff, Monocle's Helsinki correspondent. Petri, great to have you on the show. We're going to start with Baltic undersea cable sabotage. This has been a running story in the Baltics, but Sweden has now actually seized a ship.
Yes, hi Chris. So another week, another cable destroyed, it seems. It's becoming somewhat of a regular occurrence, unfortunately. But yes, yesterday at about 3 p.m. local time, the Swedish and Latvian authorities reported that an undersea data cable linking the two countries had been damaged in the Baltic Sea. And they also said that they suspected sabotage was what had caused the damage. Then, as you alluded to later then, on Sunday, Sweden announced that it actually seized a ship and boarded it because they suspected that it was behind the damage. And they actually they released photos. They found out that the anchor of the ship was damaged. And the ship's captain today has actually confessed that, yes, it was the ship's anchor, but the captain claims that it was caused by a storm. Based on what we know about this particular ship, the one that has been seized, is that it's a cargo ship sailing under the Maltese flag, and it had started its journey from a port near St. Petersburg in Russia. Now this was the sixth such incident in just over 2 years. But this was the first one to take place after NATO recently announced what they call the Operation Baltic Sentry, whose mission is to safeguard this undersea cable. So it was the first sort of a test of how NATO will react to this sabotage.
It is that first test. Tell us maybe a little bit more about this sort of NATO mission. I mean, the fact that just the way that this works, and also the fact that, as you said, you were kind of careful there by saying this is a ship that came from Russia, but countries are actually blaming Russia pretty directly at this point.
Yes. So NATO, when they announced this operation, they said that they want to keep this what is called the shadow fleet. So Russia's shadow fleet. These are not. So just to be clear, these are not Russian vessels. These are operated under all kinds of different countries. Ranging from the Cook Islands, and this was under the Maltese flag. But they all sort of sail to Russia, to and from Russia. And so this operation that NATO is carrying out is basically it involves several patrol vessels from various NATO countries, basically just patrolling in areas close to these critical undersea cables. But I mean, the experts that I've spoken with, everybody agrees that it's impossible to guard 24/7 all of these cables. So the purpose of the NATO mission is really to deter and just show that NATO is present in these areas.
Well, Petri, let's move on to another story from Norway. Now, I understand that the government there is actually teetering a bit on the brink, but we want to focus on an interesting aspect before the government collapses, and that's a new debt-free scheme.
Yeah, that's correct. I don't know about you, Chris, but I've already paid back my student loan, but there's a lot of people in Norway who haven't, and now the government is introducing a scheme where recent graduates who accept jobs in more sparsely populated areas will get up to 2,100 euros wiped off of their student debt. And according to the country's education minister, this is a no-brainer. So the point is really to develop, this is a quote, he says, to develop the whole of Norway, we need a thriving business sector and a robust welfare services. We can't let our districts be ghost towns, stripped of people and expertise. It's crucial for our national readiness, the education minister says in an interview with the Times Higher Education. But it's interesting, I mean, to show that the government means business, they're actually, the further north that you move in Norway, the more debt you get wiped off. So if you live all the way in the north in Finnmark, close to the Russian border, you can get up to 5,000 euros of debt wiped off. So I thought this quite a novel and interesting approach to sort of get people to move outside of the bigger cities and centers.
Definitely an interesting mix of incentives there, regional and debt-free. But one final story, Petri, before you go. Finland is rolling out, back where you are, Finland's rolling out an e-divorce platform. Tell us about this.
Yes, so as you said, Finland is planning to open an online service for people who want to file for divorce, and this is set to launch in a couple of months' time. And basically, the purpose is that the service will help people handle the initial stages of divorce proceedings online, and also to monitor in real time the progress of their divorce applications. And as things are now, you need to fill out all kinds of forms and paperwork and send them by mail to your local district court. But it's interesting to see, now that it's made so much easier, because I always thought that the purpose of filling out all this paperwork was to sort of prevent people from filing for divorce after a fit of marital rage or a fight. So now that you can do it online, let's see if there's an uptick in divorce filings in Finland.
Is this the sense you get over there in Finland, that some people are like, well, we just had a big argument, but I just can't fill out the forms?
I don't know. I just figured that it's such a sort of a serious issue that that's also why they wanted to sort of keep it old school, that you have to mail in the papers. And in case my wife is listening, by the way, this is purely for research purposes that I'm telling this news.
We'll keep this between us, Petri. Thank you very much. That was Petri Burtsoff, Monocle's Helsinki correspondent. This is The Briefing. And finally, on today's show, a peek into the world of fashion, because while Paris Fashion Week's menswear section is wrapped up, that only means the start of Couture Week, as the French capital's fashion calendar continues buzzing away at the start of the year. And Natalie Theodosi, Monocle's fashion director, is in Paris and joins me from there. Natalie, what's the mood over there?
Hi, Chris. It's a great mood, actually. We had a bit of a change of scene. Up until last night, all the menswear editors were here and the buyers, so it was a bit more casual, a little bit more laid back. And this morning, I went to the first show of Couture Week, which was Schiaparelli, and all of a sudden you have customers dressed to the nines in a very different mood inside some of the most beautiful venues in Paris. So very good mood, but also everyone is excited to see the end of the shows. It's been over 10 days now.
It has already been over 10 days. So let's look, before we get to Couture Week, a little bit back. The Paris Fashion Week menswear ended with some East Asian flair. Tell us about that.
Yes, I think it started and ended with a lot of amazing shows by Asian designers. My week started with the Orally show, which is a Japanese label, and it really became the highlight of the week because they've managed to really hone in their signatures and create a look that's beautiful, it's practical, and they use some of the most incredible fabrics. So buyers are naturally have been drawn to them. And towards the end of the week as well, the shows ended with another brand which is from Korea. It's called Woojang Mi. The show was held at Karl Lagerfeld's former house, and again, there was it was very impressive to see someone that really perfected everything from tailoring to sportswear. It was a full look, and you're starting to see that these brands are really setting the tone in Paris, much more than some of the French heritage labels in a way, which is interesting.
It is interesting to see that transition. Although, speaking of sort of more heritage brands, tell us a little about Hermès this weekend.
Hermès, I mean, of course, the Japanese have always been influential, and more so this season, but there are shows like Hermès that are always a highlight. And on Saturday afternoon, we all went to the Hermès show, and what really stood out is that, you know, they're known for their leather goods, for being quite a serious brand and doing the most high-end leatherware that you can imagine, but at the same time there was a little bit more playful touches this time, some more jewelry for men, bags adapted to new shapes, again tailored to menswear, and everyone left with a smile. It was really, really nice to watch.
Natalie, there's a lot of background behind you there that I can hear. Is this Couture Week getting into full
exactly.
swing over there?
I'm on the streets of Paris, kind of on my way to the Dior show. Is the next show on the schedule. So apologies for any noise.
Is that your next bit of excitement? What of Couture Week now that we're moving into that? Is the Dior show the highlight? What are you expecting in the next few days?
So Dior will be a highlight, and it's interesting. There is a lot of discussion about the future of Dior, if there's going to be a new creative director. So I am interested to see what's going to happen, or if we can get any clues from the show, which is happening in about an hour. And I'm also very excited to see the Chanel show tomorrow. It's happening at the Grand Palais. Now that it's reopened, it's back to its kind of original home. And this is one of the last collections that we're going to see that is designed by the studio before the new creative director takes over. So it will be really interesting. And I always love, this is where the VIP customers really come out, and it's so interesting to watch them, to see what they're wearing, because they are the ones that are keeping the industry going.
Dior and Chanel, back to the heritage brands. We'll let you go. Natalie Theodosi, Monocle's fashion director, thank you so much for joining us from Parisian streets. And that's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Anita Riotto, our researcher was Maisie Ringer, and our studio manager was Flynn Simons. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.